Ever feel like you're constantly trying to keep up with everything? Like trying to really understand the things that matter without getting totally lost in the weeds.
It's a struggle.
It is, right. Well, that's exactly what we're all about here. And today, we're taking a deep dive into something that's been generating a ton of buzz. This fascinating connection between, well, your gut and your mental health. Could something as simple as taking probiotics actually help with depression?
I think that's a question a lot of people are asking these days. It really makes you rethink how we approach mental health, doesn't it?
It totally does. I mean, for so long, it's been all about psychotherapy, medications, things like that. But this idea that our gut bacteria could play a role, that's definitely a fresh perspective.
For sure.
So to explore this, we've been looking at this really interesting discussion by Dr. Marco, where he breaks down a particular research study.
Mm.
So let's jump right in. First things first, probiotics. When we talk about probiotics, what exactly are we talking about putting into our bodies?
Well, at their core, probiotics are substances that basically, when you consume them, they encourage the growth of all the beneficial microorganisms that are already living in your gut. Think of it like giving your good gut bacteria a little boost.
Right, like sending in reinforcements for the good guys in your digestive system.
Exactly.
Now, I know we always hear about probiotics for, tummy troubles.
Oops, yeah.
Is that their main gig?
Yeah, it's definitely true that their benefits for gastrointestinal issues are probably the most well-established, especially when it comes to managing diarrhea, especially the kind that can happen after you take antibiotics. There's also growing interest in their potential for conditions like irritable bowel syndrome, but the research on that is still kind of in its early stages.
Hmm.
But what really caught our eye for this deep dive is this whole fascinating connection between the gut and the brain.
Yeah, that's kind of wild to think about, isn't it? That what's going on in our digestive system could actually have such a big impact on our mood and our mental state.
It really is. And a big piece of this puzzle is that your gut is actually a major production site for serotonin.
Serotonin.
Yep. And serotonin, that's a really crucial chemical messenger. It's how brain cells talk to each other, and it plays a huge role in regulating mood. What's so fascinating is that a significant portion of your body's serotonin isn't even in your brain, it's actually in your gut.
Hmm.
That's right. And this brings up all sorts of questions about what serotonin is doing there locally and whether influencing its production in the gut might have effects elsewhere, like in the brain.
Okay, so that definitely puts things in a whole new light. So this brings us to that study Dr. Marco was talking about, the one by Dr. Chen's group. What exactly were they looking at?
So Dr. Chen and their team, they were specifically interested in whether probiotics could actually make a difference for people with depression. To test this, they gave a particular type of probiotic called Lactobacillus plantarum PS128 to a group of 11 individuals. These folks were between the ages of 25 and 60. This specific strain, Lactobacillus plantarum PS128, it's actually derived from fermented foods.
Okay, so 11 people. As you mentioned, a pretty small group.
Yeah.
What about the amount of probiotic they took and for how long?
So the participants took 300 milligrams of this Lactobacillus plantarum PS128 every day for 8 weeks. Throughout that time, the researchers were keeping track of their levels of depression using a couple of standard questionnaires. These questionnaires, they basically give researchers a way to measure the severity of depression. One is called the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. It looks at things like mood, sleep, appetite. The other is called the Somatization of Depression Scale, and that one focuses more on those physical symptoms that can often go along with depression, like fatigue or pain.
Right, right.
Now, they also measured certain pro-inflammatory markers in the participants. These are kind of like signals in the body that tell us inflammation is happening. And increasingly, scientists are seeing a connection between this inflammation and how we feel mentally.
Pro-inflammatory markers. So they were also interested in whether inflammation was playing a role in any mood changes they saw.
Exactly. It's an area of growing research, and they wanted to see if the probiotic had any effect on those markers. Now, here's where it gets interesting, the study's findings.
All right, let's hear it. What did they find?
Well, they found some pretty significant positive results. Over those 8 weeks, they saw a pretty noticeable decrease in scores on both the Hamilton scale and the somatization scale. Just to give you a sense of the change, on the Hamilton scale, the average score dropped from 20 to 12.
Wow.
And on the somatization scale, the average score went from 31 all the way down to 11. Those are pretty big shifts in terms of those depression symptoms they were reporting.
Yeah, those are some pretty impressive drops. But you mentioned they were also tracking inflammation. What did they see there?
That's where things get a little more complex. They actually didn't see any significant changes in those pro-inflammatory markers. So what that suggests is that, at least In this particular study, the improvements in depression symptoms might not have been directly because of a decrease in inflammation. It hints that there might be another mechanism at work, something that doesn't involve inflammation.
Interesting. So the probiotics seem to be connected with people feeling better, at least according to these scales,
Yeah.
but not necessarily because it was directly addressing inflammation. But as we've said, this was just one study, and a small one at that. What are some things we should keep in mind as we're trying to interpret these results? What are the caveats here?
Yeah, that's where those critical thinking skills really come in. While these findings are definitely intriguing, there are some important limitations to this study that you really have to consider.
Okay.
First, like you pointed out, that sample size was tiny, only 11 participants. It's hard to say for sure if these results would hold true for a much larger, more diverse group of people.
All right, 11 people is just a very small snapshot. What else should we be thinking about?
Another really crucial point is that there wasn't a placebo control group. This was what's called an open label study. That means everyone who participated knew they were getting the Lactobacillus plantarum PS128. And in studies like this, particularly when you're dealing with a condition like depression, the placebo effect can be really, really powerful. People can actually start to feel better simply because they believe they're getting a treatment, regardless of whether that treatment is actually doing anything.
Makes sense, especially with mental health,
Yeah.
where our mindset can have such a big impact. And 8 weeks isn't exactly a long time for a study, is it?
Nope, that's another important factor. They did see these improvements within 8 weeks, but that's still a pretty short period, especially when you consider that depression and its treatment usually last much longer than 6 months. So, based on this study alone, it's really tough to know what the long-term effects might be. And because they didn't have that placebo group, it's really hard to say for sure how much of the improvement was truly because of the lactobacillus itself versus how much might have been due to a placebo response.
Okay, so while these initial findings are pretty interesting and definitely suggest an area where we need more research, it's not rock-solid evidence that this particular probiotic is a cure-all for depression. More like it points to something that's worth exploring further.
Exactly. But it does raise an interesting question. I mean, considering that many probiotics, including various lactobacilli, are generally thought to be safe for most people, is it something that individuals might consider as part of a broader approach to their well-being?
So let's talk about the practical side of things for our listeners. Even with the limitations of this specific study, it does make you think about the bigger picture of gut health. Even if this particular probiotic isn't some guaranteed fix for depression based on this research, what are some things people can do to, support a healthy gut?
Yeah, focusing on gut health is definitely a good thing, regardless of this study. And the biggest way you can influence the types of bacteria in your gut is through what you eat, through your nutrition and your diet. Consistently, what we've seen is that a diet that's high in fiber and lower in refined sugars is going to help those good bacteria flourish in your gut. We're talking about foods like beans, lentils, oats, broccoli, things like that. And different types of fiber, like soluble and insoluble fiber, can support your gut bacteria in slightly different ways.
Right, so more fiber, less processed sugar. That's pretty consistent advice when it comes to health in general, but it sounds like it really has a direct impact on our gut environment as well.
Mm.
Now, are there specific foods that are good sources of those good bacteria themselves?
Absolutely. Natural yogurt is a fantastic source of lactobacilli. And when I say natural yogurt, I mean yogurt without a ton of added sugar or artificial ingredients. What you're looking for is plain yogurt that specifically says it contains live and active cultures. Other fermented foods can also be beneficial, things like sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, but it is important to make sure they're prepared properly and be aware of any precautions associated with eating them.
Okay, and what about people who might have trouble getting enough fiber just through their diet alone?
Well, in those cases, fiber supplements can be a good way to make sure you're getting enough. And of course, there are always lactobacillus supplements or general probiotic supplements available. For most people, those are generally safe and pretty easy to find.
Yeah, you did say most people. Are there certain groups who should be extra careful about using probiotics?
Yeah, you definitely want to be cautious with folks who have severely compromised immune systems. This includes people who've had organ transplants, anyone with advanced HIV or AIDS, and people undergoing chemotherapy. For them, there's a potential risk of bacterial overgrowth or other complications, so it's super important to talk to a doctor before starting any kind of probiotic regimen.
That's really important to emphasize. So while there's potential, and it's generally safe for a lot of people, it's not something to just jump into without considering your individual health situation. And it's definitely not a replacement for standard medical care, especially for a condition like depression, right?
Absolutely. Even if future research really clarifies a role for probiotics in mental health, it's crucial to remember that consulting with mental health professionals, whether that's therapists for talk therapy or psychiatrists for medication management, remains absolutely essential for managing depression or any other mental health condition. Probiotics at this point are an exciting area of research and a potential tool, but they're not a substitute for the treatments that we know work.
Dr. Marco mentioned in his discussion that he's actually linked the original research article from the journal Nutrients for anyone listening who's interested in digging into the specifics of the study themselves.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, he also briefly mentioned a specific supplement called Unbind.io, but made it clear that his discussion wasn't sponsored, which is always good to know. And for those of you who are interested in supporting his work, there's a members button on his platform.
Fantastic. Going straight to the source is always the best way to get the full picture.
So to sum it all up for you today, we've taken a look at this intriguing initial study that examined Lactobacillus plantarum, PS128, and its potential link to improvements in depression symptoms. But those limitations are key. The small number of participants and that lack of a control group mean we can't jump to any definitive conclusions yet.
That's right. The initial findings are interesting and definitely worth investigating further, but they're not the final word. We've also talked about how probiotics are generally safe for most people and highlighted some practical steps you can take to support your gut health through diet. Things like adding more fiber and incorporating natural fermented foods.
And the bottom line is this. While this is a really exciting and rapidly evolving area of research, it's not a replacement for the treatments we already have for depression. If you're struggling with your mental health, the most important step is to reach out to a qualified healthcare professional.
Couldn't agree more. And it does leave you with a pretty thought-provoking question, doesn't it? I mean, given this increasingly clear connection between our gut and our brain, what other unexpected ways might our gut bacteria be influencing our mental and emotional well-being? What kind of amazing discoveries might we see in the future as research in this area continues? It's definitely something to watch.
Absolutely. Lots to think about.